I'll just hang out here and guys, shoot me questions here. I'll just pull it up on my tablet here so I can actually read any live chats. We got one person listening already. Oh my gosh. Augustus may or may not be here with audio. We'll have to see. Don't think it's too early to crack one. It's past 5 o'clock. So, let's see. We've got one person in the live chat. Do you have any particular questions you want us to address? One person in the live chat. If you're interested. Oh, that's a good picture. It's recording and streaming. Cool. Augustus, can you hear me? Can you hear me? This is the benefit of being early. There's always some sort of technical issue. Always.
Testing. 1, 2, 3.
There he is. Can you hear me?
And now.
Excellent.
Yes. However, you are coming through my computer speakers, and I'm trying
Okay.
to do my headphones, because if I don't, then I can only hear you and not me.
Cool. We've got at least, it looks like 2 people in the live chat. That's cool. Privada and Sam Ullman.
No way, Pravada. I haven't talked to him in a while. Dude, I don't know how to fix this. I need a sound guy.
Always. Yeah. I feel like I run into technical issues in every single time I try to do some sort of live stream. There's some sort of audio issue.
100%. Every time.
Usually audio.
I want to try this. 3, 2, 1. All right, let me hear you, man.
Can you hear me now? Testing.
All right. Yeah,
Cool.
I can hear you. You're in my headphones, but now I can't hear myself, so you gotta tell me if I'm too close, too far away, or whatever.
Well, no, you sound perfectly well.
All right, good. Then I'm going to make some tea, because I will start coughing in the middle of this if I don't.
Naturally. I'm going to go hit the restroom because I always need to in the middle of things.
I know, right? I'm going to do the same thing, man.
So we'll see. We'll let people trickle in and see if they have any particular questions we can address at the end, maybe. Sometimes you get good stuff in the live chat, so
yeah,
I will be back in a second.
I'm going to open your channel, actually, to look at the live chat myself.
Oh, cool.
All right, man. I'll be back in a minute, too.
Same.
Nice.
Okay. And we're back. Pravada says audio is fine. That's always great to hear. I'll keep the audio up there.
Testing.
Sounds good to me.
All right, I'm back. Caffeine stream.
Yeah.
Sick.
Yeah. Although tonight's poison is I don't know if it counts as beer if it's 3.5%, which I've been mixing with fruit juice anyways, so even lower.
You realize we are live already?
Yes.
Is that on purpose? No, my bad.
Oh, you're good.
Still gearing up.
I figured we'd let people trickle in and ask questions in the live chat. This is part of my technical inexpertise. Is if a good thing is going, I don't want to screw with it too much.
Gotcha. Just glad I didn't drop any bad words.
I don't think we're going to wreck our reputations any more than they already are. For some reason, our last debate from 4 years ago is age restricted, and I have no idea why. It's like the only video in my entire channel that's age restricted. It's like, and that you can't
change it?
Really? The speeches from Greg Johnson are not age restricted. The speeches from like all these other things are not age restricted, but that one is.
Naturally, they want to push homosexuality to kids. So,
if that's the thing they narrow in on, I'd be impressed. But yeah. Well, 5:59. Do you think we should get started?
I got 2100 over here, buddy.
Okay, well then let's do it.
Perfect timing. All right. So I was just thinking, actually, when is the last time we actually talked on the phone, man? I feel like we never talk anymore. Like the only time we've interacted in the past, I don't know, year and a half that I've been out, we've been through text message. I don't think I've talked to you over the phone this whole time, man.
Which is sort of sad. There's something lost in text communication, as opposed to. Which maybe ties into this question, because maybe I'll open with a question I like asking Christians, a very not super related to the subject we're actually going to be discussing, but a fun one to kick off the mood, as it were. So how
would you think you would fare in a lion's den?
Well, that's one question. Your results may vary depending on your faith. But no, a very interesting thing happened in 2000, and it sort of ties in religion with technology in a fun way. A very interesting thing happened in 2019, which is that for the first time ever, a person was baptized in virtual reality. They put on their VR headsets and met a priest, an actual ordained priest who also had a VR headset on, and a few other witnesses who were there.
You mean a Catholic priest?
I would imagine not a Catholic priest.
I really hope not.
So the thing that throws, I like to ask people's take on this, because there's a sort of innate revulsion I hear from a lot of more traditionally inclined Christians. But the fun part is what is actually theologically wrong with that. The Orthodox don't seem to have much of a problem at all. They can just go straight to tradition, which is this very sort of amorphous answer all to all problems with modernity. Catholics do seem to have a theological answer as far as why this is actually not legitimate, but I don't remember what it was offhand. And of course, Protestants have a very, very hard time, even the ones who are like, this is clearly not right. And then you explain the circumstance. You're like, oh, the woman being baptized was in a wheelchair. She hadn't been able to leave her house for several years, and this was very meaningful to her. And that seems to soften it for a lot of people. But even the ones who are like, this is clearly not legitimate, it's a little harder on the Protestant side to explain why.
I think Protestants have a hard time explaining a lot of things that they believe. And I realized when I first went to RCIA, first started going through the initiations for the Catholic Church, that when I was growing up and I was militantly anti-Christian throughout my teenage years and my 20s, it turned out I wasn't really anti-Christian. I was anti-Protestant. They drive me up the wall. Like, they actually believe that the Bible is literally true in every respect. And not only that, but it is inerrant. There is not a single flaw or contradiction within it. And that's just demonstrably false.
Well, so now, don't Catholics believe that too? They just believe that different books within the Bible are in different genres. So you couldn't judge the veracity of Proverbs as a history because it's a book of poetry. It's a different genre.
Right. There is that as well. But there's also the fact that, there are clearly things in the Bible that just go against each other. There are clear contradictions in the Bible. And the Catholic Church's position is, well, that's why we have the church. That's why we have 2,000 years of history of saints and geniuses saying, here's my interpretation of this, and the Catholic Church has given its stamp of approval on it, whereas Protestants just say, well, it's my interpretation, it's between me and Jesus, so you can go fly a kite. I don't care what you think. So if they run into a sticky thorn of a problem, well, they're just relying on, well, I just feel like Jesus understands me. When I have a problem with virtual reality baptism, I just know he doesn't like it. There's no real foundation for it, intellectually, spiritually, historically, nothing.
Right.
I can tell you I imagine the Orthodox position that you're talking about is, well, Jesus was baptized with real water in a real river, so we should probably stick with real water at the very least. The Catholic position, I'm obviously not a priest and never will be, so I'm just speaking as a lay Catholic here. But I imagine there's something to be said for the fact that God created the world, and the sacraments are a participation within the material world that God has created. And so doing a virtual reality baptism is a sacrilege of that sacrament. It's blaspheming that sacrament. It's just against the entire spirit of it, because it's not in the natural world. It's completely unnatural. It's a novelty. And there's novelty for the sake of novelty, even within the Catholic Church. There's
So would you
Cold War
say
maybe of traditionalists and modernists, but I don't even think the modernists would do something as insane as supporting that.
So would you say that connection to the material world is in some sense important in baptism?
I think it's essential in any sacrament, because there are 7 sacraments, right? You've got baptism itself. That's the first. You've got confession. You've got communion. You've got marriage, taking holy orders. All of these things are necessarily within the physical world. You can't marry someone in virtual reality, have virtual reality sex with your virtual wife and think that that's a sacrament. Obviously, it is not. When you take communion, that is the literal flesh and blood of Jesus Christ. There's a miracle of transubstantiation. That can't happen in virtual reality. These things are physically in the world, and a baptism in virtual reality is not. And you said that, well, it softens some Christians to hear, well, she's in a wheelchair, this means a lot to her. That doesn't change anything. Like, you could say, well, gay people want to be married. It means a lot to them to think that they're married. It doesn't change the fact they can't have children, that their marriage is not a real marriage. It's a perversion. It's an abomination. And I'd say that as a pagan or a Catholic. Gay people just plain can't be married. It's not based in reality. And you can't have a baptism online, no matter how the person in a wheelchair feels about it. If the priest wants to do something good, he can get up and walk over to that woman's house. He can drive there. He can take a plane. Like, there's no reason except, oh, look how cool this novel thing is that we're doing.
So what makes the whole question interesting to me, and maybe this will transition into the actual subject of our debate, which is whether Christianity or paganism is the better foundation for the earthly values that we both share, is in a religion in which the world and the flesh and all attachments to the material of this world are evil, or if not evil in themselves, at best a distraction from where we should be keeping, I'm putting on my Christian hat to say this, where we should be keeping our treasure in the spirit, which is in the hereafter, not in this world. It seems hard to explain why the material elements of baptism are important in a ritual that is designed to separate you from the material, to crucify the flesh, as it were, and to become like the spirit that comes this way and moves that way, and no one knows from whence it comes and whither it goes. Which is,
that's true.
Allegorically very much like virtual reality. People can come and go wherever they please. It seems like a world of pure spirit in a strange but perhaps somewhat corrupt way.
Well, I'd say even beyond corrupt, I think Christians would say it's outright satanic. It's a perversion of that. So, I mean, when Christ said that exact thing, then one knows whither it goes. I mean, he's comparing it to the wind, which is a very real thing, a very material thing. But it's just like a black mass, for instance, right? It's based on the actual traditional Latin Catholic mass, and it's a perversion of it. Same thing with virtual reality. Like, yes, it is. You're talking about the kingdom of God as this separate spiritual reality. Virtual reality is the black mass of that. It's this fake artificial reality that claims to be, oh, well, we can do really spiritual things here, like baptize online, or we can, read your tarot cards, or do online Reiki, or whatever you're going to do to raise your consciousness, and all these new age garbage things. But really, it's a perversion of the real kingdom of God that is spiritual.
Well, I'm imagining a world in which people go into VR to hang out at the gym and
it's only a matter of time.
Press imaginary weights up.
It's only that's not already there, bro. It's only a matter of time.
It's
I imagine somebody's got that, though, because they've got like virtual boxing or Wii boxing, Wii tennis, all that stuff. It's like, dude, just go to the tennis court.
Just go play tennis. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, shadow box, anything, but people do it, and it's a multi-million-dollar industry.
It's just why we should talk more on the phone, perhaps. But
true.
Anyways, let's get into the actual subject matter. We're here to debate Christianity versus paganism, and of course, for those who are not familiar with us, with me, Chris Robertson, or our good friend Augustus here, we've got a very interesting background in that Augustus was quite involved in the pagan world, specifically the occult world, more than I'd say 99% of the people who claim to be involved in that world, and has recently converted to Catholicism, and not without after having done a fair bit of research into that world. Conversely, I've spent a fair bit of time, in church and in churches and studying Christian theology, and in and out in my own history, which I sort of explain in my book on against Christianity behind me here, Holy Nihilism. And so we've after having debated before from opposite ends, me defending Christianity 4 years ago and Augustus challenging it, we've found ourselves on opposite sides. So it's should be a fun and hopefully maybe a higher level conversation on the matter than what most people are used to hearing. So, Augustus, why don't you kick it off? Because I'm curious, what was for you the straw that led you to Christianity? I remember listening to your video explaining the sort of cultural draw and the value of the therapy that priests can provide in a world of feminist secular therapists, and there's just so much sanity and beauty in the Catholic world in particular. But knowing you, I imagine something kicked it over that made you believe it was true and not just useful. And if you wouldn't mind explaining, what was that?
So that's a lot of what has happened in the past year and a half. I think I made the point in the video, in the confessions, that this is actually being like a 12-year conversion for me. This is not even something that's happened in the past couple years. I went through RCIA back when I was in law school. When I was a first or second year law student, I started RCIA.
Quick interruption. What is RCA?
RCIA is the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults. It is the program through which anyone over 18 is going to go through when they become Catholic. Most people going through RCIA are Protestants. They are not pagan. I am definitely one in a million on that front. And now my wife is in RCIA. Well, long story short, she's basically in RCIA. She's in her catechism program. So going from pagan to Catholic is a very rare thing these days.
Right.
So that's where it started, was 12 years ago. And like you said, I always saw it as cultural. It's the foundation of Western civilization. It's the foundation of our legal system, which is important to me as a lawyer. But really, even when that part you talked about came up, where it wasn't for my sake that I was looking into therapy and talking about going to the priest instead of a therapist, that was for my kids, because of all the terrible things that happened to my family. But even that was not the straw that did it. From that point, I just resolved, I'm going to go to the Catholic Church. I'm going to do whatever I've got to do to bring my kids into the Catholic Church. I'm going to give them a better life. So I got out of jail after an extraordinarily long period of time. I went back to the church, and then nothing went the way that it was supposed to go. I did not get them back immediately. The people who did this to me were not crucified. Nothing I wanted was actually happening, and I kept jumping through hoops and doing this, that, and the other, and I was going to mass every week. I ended up being recruited to the lay Dominicans, believe it or not. A lot of stuff happened. I went through Lent, mass every day, Stations of the Cross, everything. And at a certain point, I realized, well, if you want to actually raise your children in the church, you have to actually do these things. You can't just say, oh, we'll go to mass on Sundays and, we'll say we're there. And we'll just put them in Catholic school and wash my hands of it. Like, kids see through things like that. So especially my older kids who were baptized when I first had gone through RCIA and gone into the church. So my older kids, I had to put them through their confirmation program. They're all teenagers. So they would 100% see through something like that. So I had to go through all the motions, go through everything myself, do everything the right way. And then still things did not go as I planned on getting the younger kids into the church. And it wasn't until I actually, this is the straw, the long answer to your question, just somewhere along the way, it became real. It became not just going through the motions, but actual devotion. I was volunteering at the Adoration Chapel. Like, that's wild. That's I was right. Presently, I'm doing the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius, like going on retreats, like just things that I absolutely did not plan when I was a child. Yeah, exactly. Which is hardcore. It's the saint maker.
Yeah.
So all of these things were beyond the original scope of the plan, which is just, I'm going to go through the motions, get my kids in the Catholic Church, give them a better life. It eventually became something where I had to do everything right, crossing all my T's, dotting all my I's, and eventually that deepened into actual devotion and faith.
Interesting. So I'm familiar with this process because what you managed to achieve is actually what I was trying to do. I had rejected Christianity in my mid to late teens, and after being quite a sincere believer for some time, and when I got into my mid 20s, I decided, well, maybe I should get back into this, and I didn't believe, but my what I tried to do was I said, well, I'll just go through the motions, and I'll act sort of as if I believe it, in the hopes that belief will sort of follow from the actions. And
right.
Instead, what happened was it became more clear to me that the original reasons that I had been trying to get into that, get back into Christianity, were in fact bad reasons, were in fact not legitimate reasons. And the thing that kicked it off was the discovery of a particularly punchy verse, which was Luke 14. So I wanted to reconnect with my family. So family seems to be a strong tie-in for both of us as far as why we want to go back into Christianity. Isn't this a path back to Western civilization, to our nation, to our family, to a future for all of these things?
Which I don't know is necessarily a bad motivation.
No, it's not. It's a very
to evolve.
It's a very good motivation. And then you come across a verse like Luke 14:26, where Jesus says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, and yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." And so it seemed to me, as I was progressing through my attempt to become Christian back in, when was this, 2018, 2019, somewhere in that vicinity, it seems clear that first of all, the sort of Jungian, Jordan Petersonian archetypal explanations of Christianity don't fly. That's, it either is true or it is not, and a certain degree of historicity is required. That doesn't mean every book of the Bible is literal, obviously, but it does mean that the core historical message of Jesus, first of all, of humanity being fallen, of Jesus being truly the incarnation of the Logos and God in person, and also man, and dying on the cross and being buried and resurrecting himself and rising again from the grave for our sins. Like, if that did not actually literally happen, then your faith is in vain. So the sort of Campbellian, Petersonian, Jungian stuff is out. And the family connection thing is not valid. Jesus repeatedly calls for people to leave their own family to follow him. Not just to hate your family and love your enemy in that sense, but basically, because Christianity, of course, does encourage and even command people to love their family, but not in a way that is different from the way that they love everyone else. And the more I dug from that sort of point outward, it seemed to me that Christian morality seemed to be the basis for a lot of modernist morality, especially as it concerns equality and what we see with social justice today.
Well, I've definitely been one of the proponents of that line of thought. Tomislav Sunic wrote a book on that. I talked about it ever since. I read that in law school. And I've often pointed out that Christianity overthrew the hierarchical pagan world, burned all its books, burned all its libraries, destroyed all its statues, and it paved the way for republicanism, which paved the way for communism, this egalitarian stream of thought. It's all rooted in Judeo-Christianity. It all goes back to that. And that's how I saw it too. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, though. I think it's one of those things where, you see an animal and it has a human face on it, but it's actually just its shell, and we recognize patterns. Sometimes patterns that aren't necessarily there. Sometimes we have faulty perceptions of cause and effect. And I think that might be one of them. And the family thing, see, this is probably one of the biggest things.
Wait. Hang on. Are you accusing Marxists of appropriating and misusing concepts?
Oh, I would never. They would never do such a thing. They have ultimate truth, as a matter of fact. That's
they're a science. Yes.
Yeah, and science, of course, historical science. No, but one of the biggest things that has pushed me to believe that it's not just convenient or practical and not just a way to better family life is the fruits of it, right? Like Christ said, you shall know them by their fruits. I think of paganism, neo-paganism, that is, not pre-Christian paganism, but paganism as we understand it today. And I think of
very important distinction. Yes.
Yes, it is. It is. And you look at all the people that I've known, like what temples have they built? What communities have they built? What structures, what infrastructure do they have? I've had personal firsthand experience in attempting to build those things, and it just cannot and has not historically been done. Whereas you look at Christianity, and yes, there are passages in the Bible that say, I come not with peace, but with a sword. Take up your cross and follow me. Whoever hates not his mother and father cannot be my disciple. All those things. But if you look at the fruits of Christianity, and you look at the entire religion and its history, it's very clear that it is family oriented, as paganism, at least certain sects of paganism, claim to be. Other sects are obviously anti-family, but even the ones like heathenism, right, which are explicitly pro-family. Is it actually the case?
So the fruits of the Spirit are listed in Galatians, right? They're love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law, and that's where people usually stop. But the next verse after that is, those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. And what distinguishes it's not as if people didn't appreciate love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control prior to Christianity. It's not as if Paul comes down and says, oh, these are the fruits of the Spirit, and people are like, oh, we had no idea those were good things.
Yeah, those are totally new words to us.
What makes these uniquely Christian values, or not values, let me take that back, uniquely Christian fruits in character qualities, is their decontextualization. Against such things there is no law. These are not appropriate or inappropriate actions in a particular context. They are virtues and character qualities to develop no matter what, no matter the context. So in the Bible there is actually a pagan book of sorts, and that book is Ecclesiastes. It is essentially a thought experiment done by a very wise man who we don't know who he was exactly. There is some speculation, but as a kind of thought experiment of what would life be like without God? What would life be like under the sun? What would the good life look like? And that's where it is, vanity, all is vanity, everything is chasing after the wind. There's, it's good to be wise, but there's no point in being too wise. There's no point in anything, really. But it's in that context, it's in the context of the pagan book in the Bible, that we see that there is a time and a purpose for every emotion. There's a time and a season for every purpose under heaven, a time to love and a time to hate, a time to go to war and a time to be at peace, and so on and so forth. What the New Testament and the overarching message of the Bible in general advocates is that, as I've read it anyways, is that if you have your heart in heaven, if you have your heart in jars of clay in the world hereafter, there is no reason to be concerned about anything on this world. There's no reason not to be loving and patient and peaceful and kind and good and faithful and so forth, because everything in this world is passing away, including your family, which Mormons notwithstanding, they're an exception to my argument. But
I don't think they count anyway.
Yeah. to their credit.
Include them,
to their credit, I would say. Shout out to the Mormons, I suppose. But within this context, and if you were to summarize the entire Bible in one passage, Jesus sort of gives it when Nicodemus asks him, what is the most important law in the books? And Jesus says, I'm sure you know, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all your mind, all of your strength, all of your being. And the second one is like it. Completely unprompted. He gives the second one, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, how can you love your neighbor if you're loving God with all of your heart? And the answer is in the Imago Dei. The answer is in the doctrine of humans being image bearers of God. We love God by way of loving the body of Christ, which is the church, which is other people. But that leaves no room for distinction between family and stranger, between fellow citizen and alien. It leaves no room for distinction on matters of nation or family or even individuality. You must hate even your own life to be the disciple.
Yeah, but I think there might be a conflation here between political statements and spiritual ones. And I always promote Carl Schmitt, who is my favorite legal philosopher. He happened to be Catholic as well. Mm-hmm. And he would point out, when Christ said love your enemies, he was talking about personal enemies. He wasn't talking about political ones. He wasn't saying, Chinese... No. And he makes this argument very convincingly. And it's big, like saying to the Chinese, you need to love the Mongols, and if they invade one village, give them another. That would be insane. You can't say something like that.
So like what would you say?
When Genghis Khan comes in and starts beheading everybody, you just say, "Oh, please behead me as well." Like that's not at all what was meant. There is a political enemy, and there is the hostis inimicos, and there is the personal enemy, and that is to whom you turn the other cheek. That is a spiritual enemy.
So then, what would we make of Psalm 139, where King David it's essentially a verse, a psalm in 3 parts, and it's one of the things that led me astray in writing In Defense of Hatred, actually, because I did what all Christians do, and I found a single verse out of context that agreed with my position. Yes.
Oh yeah.
Validation, copy paste, and point it. And
especially from the Psalms, yeah.
Right, and I was transcribing Rev videos, and I happened to cross a theologian that, without knowing me, corrected me on that, and that was a funny experience. But the essence of Psalm 139 is in 3 parts, and it begins with him. The longest part is him saying, Lord, you know everything about me. You know my thoughts before I even have them. You knew me before I was stitched together in my mother's womb. There's no point in sharing anything with you because you already know it. You already know everything there is to know about me, even more than I know about myself. But I'm going to come to you anyways. I'm going to share my heart with you anyways. And then he just unloads. He says, screw these people. Do I not hate them, O Lord, who hate thee? I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them mine enemies. I'm sure I'm misquoting it exactly. But they're not personal enemies, at least not the way he's describing it. They are enemies of God, in his opinion. And he's saying, do I not hate them, O Lord, who hate thee? And after he vents in this way, which I mistook in my youth for the substance, he concludes by saying, essentially, and I don't remember this part verbatim, but it's I don't know if this is right or wrong to feel this way. Guide me on the path of righteousness. And then when you look at the example of Jesus, you see something more illustrative about what the Christian conception of what the righteous path looks like as far as vengeance and hatred is concerned, which is to turn the other cheek. And
in the Second Vatican Council in the 60s, they did a lot of moving things around and changing everything in the liturgy. It used to be that those psalms were in the divine office. Those psalms were in the Mass. The psalms were everything, and that's because Jesus prayed the psalms. The psalms have been the foundation for Christian liturgy for 2,000 years. Vatican II came around, and they started changing that. And at this point, what are we, 60 years later, people are like, well, I don't think I like Psalm 18. I don't think I like Psalm 27. He's talking about grinding his enemies into the dust. He's talking about, going to war against entire peoples. Like, He's subjugating foreign nations. How could you talk about that?
But is he, though? Because that's sort of that's the trap of Psalm 139. It's him bringing his heart to God, right? Which is the important part. And it's Psalm 139 is not saying that these violent thoughts are right. What it's saying is that it's right to bring your thoughts to God, even if they're wrong.
Right.
Which is a very different message. But
there are 150 Psalms, and some of them really are thanking God for victory over your enemies and asking God for very literal conquest of your enemies and literally killing them by the tens of thousands. That's in the Psalms. It's inescapable. However, part of salvation history is the Christ being the fulfillment of all of these scriptures, not just the law and the prophets, but the Psalms as well. He would pray them. They were taken as prophecies for his coming. And so now people have a more spiritual interpretation of the Psalms, but there's no getting around the fact that when David was writing the Psalms, 100%, they were about political enemies. They were about foreign nations. They were about people you were literally going to war with. There's no dressing it up as, spiritual truth devoid of historical circumstance. So I think now there's been an evolution in what the Psalms mean and in what enemies mean and forgiveness and conquest and what does it mean to conquer your enemies. And a very real personal experience of mine has actually been directly involved with that. And a lot of your critiques of Christianity seem to be intellectual ones, like, well, these things don't make sense intellectually.
They're spiritual, right? Because to me, Ecclesiastes 3 has always actually all of Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiastes 3 has always appealed to me as a very balanced and honest approach to what life is like. And that idea that there is a time for all of these different purposes, and wisdom lies in knowing what is appropriate in what context. And it's not something that you can explain in some kind of equation. There's not some just straight answer, just do this every time and you'll be okay. No, it takes discretion and experience and failures, perhaps, to learn these things. And that's just an inescapable fact of life. But what we find in the New Testament is the exact opposite of that. It says, no, against these things there actually is no law. Always be faithful, always be loving, always be charitable, even when love itself requires hatred. Mm-hmm. And we see this in Christian just war doctrine from Augustine, where he says, what is evil? I arranged a quick little quote list here for quick reference. He says, what is evil in war? Is it the death of some who will die in any case, that others may live in peaceful subjection? This is mere cowardly dislike, not any religious feeling. The real evils in war are the love of violence, revengeful cruelty, fierce and implacable enmity, wild resistance, and the lust of power. And to me, that seems like it is exactly at odds with the wisdom of Ecclesiastes 3. Isn't there a time for that kind of vengeful brutality even? And then, after that, there is a time for reconciliation, which perhaps we didn't do as well as we could and have in a few instances in the past century. But it's not really an intellectual. There are intellectual problems you can point out, but the issue is primarily with the spirit that comes from these beliefs, and the spirit that arises from authentic Christianity is the moral reductio ad absurdum against the beliefs themselves, because all of this hinges upon a moral assumption that the world is fallen and in need of saving. If it is not fallen and not in need of saving, then Jesus died for nothing. Then the resurrection is an interesting historical account of no moral or spiritual significance. So if the world is not fallen, and that is a moral intuition that we have, and it could be right or wrong, but our belief or disbelief that the world is fallen and in need of spiritual salvation is a moral intuition. And if we are to believe that moral intuition, then other morally counterintuitive things in the Bible become a lot more significant.
So it may be that Augustine is saying something that appears to be in contrast with Ecclesiastes, or that St. Paul is saying something that appears to be. But the Pharisee said the same exact thing about Christ, saying, well, what you are saying is in complete contradiction. What you are doing is in complete contradiction to the law when you are healing people on the Sabbath, or your disciples are eating wheat, reaping on the Sabbath. Like, these things are 100% illegal. They're complete contradiction. But really, that's why Christ said these are the two greatest laws, to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. He's not contradicting the law, he's fulfilling the law. That was he said that over and over. And it's kind of the same thing with, the fruits of the Spirit, or just war, or saying that we are going to be baptized in the Spirit, or born of the Spirit rather than of woman or of the flesh.
Right.
It's not in contradiction to the Old Testament, but it is an evolution of it. And I'd point out that until the Second Vatican Council, until modern times, the Old Testament was considered the Old Testament for a reason. It's in the past, it's not relevant to what's going on now. The focus is on the Gospels and the New Testament. It's really Protestants that started going back to the Old Testament, saying, well, we need to be more Jewish in the things that we're doing. We need to go back to roots, and these are the roots. And the Catholic Church did have psalms, and always has, in the divine office and as part of the Mass. But it was really the Protestants who said, well, we need to go back to the quote-unquote scriptures. We need to go back to the Jewish texts and see, what were the law and the prophets, and let's live by that, and let's, post the 10 Commandments in the courthouse. And all of those things were Protestant things going on.
Well, isn't the Catholic and Orthodox tradition still grounded in Scripture? They have a tradition of interpretation, but that doesn't mean that it isn't grounded in Scripture itself.
Right. So
and by extension, in these moral intuitions that give the New Testament Scripture significance.
Yes. So, like in some points of the New Testament, especially in the Synoptic Gospels, or all four of the Gospels, they will point out, well, none of his bones were broken on the cross, and this is a fulfillment of this passage in Exodus, and they'll quote that. Or, Peter, on the day of Pentecost, he's quoting from the book of Joel. So, yeah, there are definitely passages in the New Testament hearkening back to the Old. But if you look at the actual liturgy of what is being prayed at the Mass, what is being prayed at the divine office, or the liturgy of the hours, where, when Jesus was praying, he would say the Psalms 7 times a day. And so the Catholic Church does the same thing, where you have the divine office throughout the hours of the day, and you're praying the Psalms. It's only a modern thing, like I'm saying, that they brought the Old Testament in. It used to be 100% either the Psalms or the New Testament. If you go to a traditional Latin Mass today, they're not doing readings from Exodus and Deuteronomy and Isaiah. They're doing readings from the New Testament. You have the epistle, and then you have the gospel. Those are the readings. If you go to a modern Catholic Church, the Novus Ordo, they have Old Testament readings, and that's because of the Second Vatican Council. That's a new thing.
So then, in discussing what we might mutually understand as true Christianity and not Protestant corruptions of it, we would be better off sticking to the New Testament then. Is that your position?
That is my position, yeah.
Okay. So I think
and not that I have a problem with the Old Testament. I talk about the Old Testament all day long. I'm not saying it's evil or anything. I'm just saying that
the New Testament itself says that it is the culmination of the Old Testament. So it's not a rejection of the Old Testament as unimportant. It's just in matters of
like a
spiritual
of the Old Testament.
Yeah, like the Quran and the way in which newer verses supersede the older and fulfill, and therefore we move on to the next stage of evolution and so forth. But it's the New Testament spirit that I suppose I can just say I have an issue with. We find in the
So there's the difference between saying, well, the New and Old Testaments conflict, which, granted, I'm not going to argue that. Of course, they conflict, and
I'm not even going to argue that they do conflict. I don't. Right.
Well,
but anyways.
You were saying that the line about the fruits of the Spirit conflicts with Ecclesiastes. Like, you could point things like that out all the time.
But Ecclesiastes is not saying this is necessarily how the world is. Ecclesiastes, the author of Ecclesiastes, is saying, suppose we lived in a world without God. It's a kind of thought experiment of life without God. It's what would be good without God? What would the good life look like in a world without God? And that's where he says, vanity, vanity, everything is vanity. Everything is chasing after the wind. There's no point. The best you can do is to enjoy the good in your work and, enjoy the good things in life, but not too much lest you destroy yourself too early. And that's really all there is under the sun. So therefore, fear God and do his will, and so forth.
So it seems like what you're saying is, well, I can abide by that, but it's the New Testament spirituality I have a problem with.
Well, yes. I mean, we see in, and this is the quote I kick off the whole book with, 1 John 2:15 through 17. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. And of course, family and nation, and indeed your own self, your own life, are things of the flesh. Those connections are things of the flesh. It's almost Buddhist in its desire to escape the trap of attachment to transient things that will pass away. And that is the sentiment and the spirit that permeates the New Testament, and which makes the fruits of the Spirit the decontextualized virtues of indestructible love and peace and joy. A joy that can never be hurt. What would it look like to be joyful no matter what bad things happen to your family or yourself? Like Job comes to mind. Even Job was not joyful in the face of all that. But in any case, that's the spirituality that seems to permeate the New Testament, and what would follow from what Jesus claims to be the most important law, which is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, to leave no room in your heart for anything else.
So I don't think it's necessarily a novel thing for John to say this, for somebody to say that you should be unaffected by things. Like if you're talking about joy in the face of sorrow, or joy in the face of horrible circumstances like Job, there's a reason that the Catholic Church has never had a problem with Aristotle or Marcus Aurelius, right? Where a lot of Christians will quote the Meditations all day long. Stoic philosophy and Christianity sometimes go hand in hand. A lot of these New Age types have even theorized that between the ages of 12 and 30, Jesus must have gone off to India and China and studied Buddhism, because all these things are, like you pointed out, pretty much a parallel with Buddhism in the fact that it's going for the spiritual and a divorce from the world. Actually, what brought me to it was yoga, and I was an avid student of the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, especially. The Bhagavad Gita was my book, and if you look at things like taking as equal, pleasure and pain, gain and loss, victory and defeat, gird thyself for the battle, thus shalt thou not incur sin. That line alone, that's 238, I think, in the Bhagavad Gita. That line alone is such a parallel that it's astounding. Like, first of all, it speaks of sin, and that opens up an entire conversation about sin is not a novel concept in Judaism or in Christianity. Sin is a concept across all ancient religions, really. The sacrifices being made to Jupiter by the Pontifex Maximus, these were not just like, neo-pagan, like, oh, well, give me something. Like, you're atoning for something. In a vast majority of cases, you are atoning for sin. You have offended the gods. You have done something wrong. And that's not novel Christianity. And neither is the concept that you should be aspiring to attain something spiritual. And that's how yoga got me to, or back to, I should say, the Catholic Church. Things like celibacy, the vows of celibacy. And it was funny enough, Gandhi, who I read his autobiography. I was like, oh my God, look at all these things that I do, and I don't even like this guy. But we have the same practices. And Gandhi's practices actually were a lot of Catholic practices too. His prayers, his devotions, the vow of celibacy. And you could talk all day long about the parallels between yoga or Hinduism and Catholicism. But in the end, this notion that, well, John says that, if you don't love the Spirit and hate the world, there's no love of God in you. That's maybe a radical way of saying it, but it's not really a radical concept in terms of world religions. So I wouldn't discount it on that ground.
Yeah, there are certainly other parallels for sure. Like I said before, Buddhism comes to mind, and certain ascetic disciplines within Hinduism certainly parallel that too. I want to take a minute to address the super chat here. The live, not super chat. We're not that big. The live chat here. Kyle,
5 people are throwing us.
Yeah, Kyle is mourning the lack of burnt sacrificed goats in his backyard. And I want to say, Martin, cool it with the anti-Semitic remarks. I love having that quote in my back pocket. Anyways,
I'm a child of divorce. Give me a break.
Right.
That movie has 1,000 quotes that you could use on a daily basis.
There are more important issues than Sri Lanka to worry about. That's for sure. Yeah, no, the parallels with Hinduism are interesting, I suppose. What distinguishes them is that in Christianity there's a unique eschatology that undergirds these values and these beliefs, and you are supposed to develop the spirit for a particular reason. And like you said before, the way you can sort of see similarities in clouds or other things and see patterns, sort of a false positive in our pattern recognition software. There are some similarities, some superficial similarities in the spirit between Christianity and Buddhism, Stoicism, certain aspects of Hinduism, and so forth. But the underlying reason is different, and the underlying reason, I think, gives a different flavor to it. I'm not a huge fan of a lot of ascetic disciplines precisely for the imbalance that they seem to lead towards. I remember Nietzsche once arguing that Asiatic Buddhism was a symptom of too much rice consumption, and it's just maybe true or false, but the symptom of it of people who have become bored with life and are just looking forward to an end of things. Asceticism does seem to be related to that at a
right.
sort of
it talks
esoteric
about the preachers of death too, and that was one of his biggest things that he harped on all the time. Like, look, if you Christians want to talk about death and heaven and this place is so bad, like, just die then. Like, stop preaching all this death and just die. Go away. Like, leave us alone.
Right.
And I get it, because if you think there is the Catholic teaching that if you kill yourself, you go to hell, you don't go to heaven. So that's probably counts Catholics out. But what about the people who don't believe that that's a mortal sin? Why not kill yourself, right? So
the correct answer to antinatalists.
Right. So yeah, I get the sentiment. Right. If you're going to go around preaching that everything is evil, everything is negative, everything is bad, like, nobody wants you around. Like, go home, get out of here. It's a very negative thing. And those people do exist. There's no debating that. Like, Nietzsche was right about a lot of things. And by things, I mean Christians. One of the biggest problems with Christianity is Christians. One of the biggest reasons people walk away from Christianity is Christians. They can be total hypocrites. They can be, horrible people, doing horrible things to people out of one side of their mouth, saying horrible things, and out of the other side of the mouth, praising Jesus. Right. It's awful. And you see people like that, you see the example they're setting, and you think, I don't want anything to do with that. But at the same time, Nietzsche also was the first to say, it's not that I have a problem with Jesus Christ.
So I have a problem with Paul.
I have a problem with Christianity. Yeah, that too. Yeah.
With Paul.
Crowley said that too. Yeah. That it's not even Christianity; it's Paulianity. So it's not that. Yeah, people have but really, it's not even Paul. It's Christians. It's the people who claim to be followers of the Christ. Those are the problem. That's the reason nobody wants to be a Christian. And I totally get that, because, that's who I grew up with. I grew up around Protestants, and I walked away from it and became militantly anti-Christian because of it.
Mm-hmm. And of course, from within the Christian theological framework, fallen and imperfect and even hypocritical and corrupt Christians is what that worldview would predict in a fallen world with a fallen and sinful people who are struggling with their own separation from their Creator, and looking at the shortcut, have their heart in the wrong place.
And the apostles are the first examples of that, right? Peter, upon whom the entire church is founded, says, "No, I don't even know this guy. I had nothing to do with him."
Three times.
Yeah. Like, the guy that Christianity is founded upon denies Christ in public. That's striking. Mm-hmm. And so, that should be setting the bar for everybody. Like, everybody's going to screw up. But at the same time, some people are bigger screw-ups than other people. Some people are really bad examples, and they give everybody a bad name. You could say the same thing about the white nationalist movement. You could say the same thing about Republicans. Say the same thing about people in jiu-jitsu. Like, there are douchebags about. There are bad people around, and they give a bad name to the group to which they are attached.
Right. I would agree with that. I guess that doesn't answer the theological and spiritual criticisms. Obviously, I think it does successfully answer the desire to not associate with Christianity because of Christians. But, assuming Christianity is true, all the imperfection among Christians in the world couldn't keep you away, or shouldn't be able to keep you away from attending church and those things.
Right. So that's like that Nietzschean argument about people being the reason, or it's not even his argument. It's just, that's why, matter of fact, people walk away. Like, that works if you're a teenager. But when you're an adult, you know theology, or prayer, like that should not be a legitimate excuse anymore.
Yeah, well, Nietzsche's argument isn't that, like, the people are hypocrites. It's more to the matter of Christianity hates life. It's a religion against life itself.
Well, because on which book you're reading, yeah.
Well, right, he does change his mind.
And Zarathustra, you're right. That is his main argument. Preachers of death. But in other areas, he is arguing, like, look, these people are just, like, will to power, for instance. He does that a lot, talking about, or the Antichrist. So it depends on where you're reading, but he's made every argument conceivable against Christianity, and some of them, they hold water, Yeah, but to me, the fact that all of Christianity seems to hinge upon this moral intuition of the world being fallen is the sort of the hinge point. If the world is fallen, that would imply a sort of singular perfected state that it had fallen from. Right. And when we look around us at the world we inhabit, we live in a dynamic and shifting state where things change and other things change and adapt to those changes. And the very concept of a singular perfect state implies a static state that never seemed to have existed, even in theory, because everything is in a transient and perfecting a state of becoming rather than being, to use some
esoteric philosophical jargon, in the context of a world in flux, in the context of a world that's constantly changing and adapting. The idea that we were once perfect in our virtue in one context, well, as soon as the context changes, we become deficient merely by standing still. And so the very concept of a fallen world seems to be grounded on a faulty presupposition, of a faulty presumption that denies and contradicts the dynamic world that we see before our eyes and experience.
But isn't it an a priori assumption then that we can even theorize about what that state of perfection was, which we can argue is symbolized by the Garden of Eden, by the initial creation, by God in the first 6 days? Like, that's clearly not literally true. The world was not created in 6 days. I think everybody can agree upon that, unless you're an evangelical. But can we really theorize on what that state of perfection was and say, well, it must have contrasted with this or that? Like, there's no reference point whatsoever. So why, I guess, be offended or take issue with the fact that there is original sin, or that, separation from God because you are a creation somehow creates it fall? Like, is it just the moral prescription, like the moral judgment that fallen means bad, and that we are necessarily like in need of a savior and of salvation? Like, is that just like, what is it that bothers you about that?
Well, I suppose in Christian morality, sin is separation from God. So
right. I think that's not just Christian. Like I said, that's yoga too. That is Hinduism.
Yeah. Well, there are we could say 5 basic moral theories, right? Divine command is one of them, but it's not the only one. There's Aristotelian virtue ethics. There's deontology. There's utilitarianism. Yeah, half count. Yeah. And there's, of course, nihilism as well.
Situationalism.
Is that a blend?
Yeah, that's a newer one. So one of the best examples out of that book was if you're going mountain climbing, for instance, like somebody falls down, you're at the grocery store, somebody falls down, you're going to stop and help them, right? Like your vegetables are not as important as getting this guy a doctor or making sure he's okay.
Right.
But if you are climbing Mount Everest and you're like 100 feet from the summit, somebody falls down, you do not stop. Everybody knows that once you pass that certain altitude, it is a death zone, and helping anyone else is going to get you killed. So on Earth, at sea level, we all have this, everybody knows, yeah, of course, you stop and help the guy, but there becomes a certain place, a certain situation where morality changes, where you're at an altitude where that isn't categorical any longer. That is situational ethics.
Well, I'm on board with that. It sounds like an unnecessary rebranding of virtue ethics, but just
well,
we're just gonna call discernment a new word, and we made something new. Cool. Well, yeah, I mean,
when you got a PhD in philosophy, that's what you do.
You can talk about
making up things.
You can talk about fake barns and all kinds of crazy and trolleys and stupid things no one cares about. Yeah. But the concept of sin is unique to divine command theory, right? So it presumes the existence of God, because if God doesn't exist, then sin as a moral failure for separation from God would also not exist. We would have other kinds of moral faults, being a utilitarian being the top one, but vices from being from within the virtue ethics framework, or failure to uphold duties within a deontological framework. Christianity and or yogic divine command theory is not the only basis for morality, even if it is the basis for sin. But if we begin descriptively, saying what do we all intuit is morally wrong, what do we all begin with agreement on what's morally wrong, as C.S. Lewis does at the beginning of Mere Christianity, some of the presuppositions, some of the moral instincts we have that ground the Christian worldview become troublesome.
Well, when you say sin is unique to divine command theory, I think that's because we're categorizing things from our modern perspective. Deontology, utilitarianism, whether it's situationalism or Aristotelian virtue ethics, all of these things are pretty modern in the grand scheme of things. I mean, if yoga goes back 10,000 years, if Christianity goes back 2,000 years, like, yes, Aristotle predated Catholicism, but the concept of sin itself, that is from the origins of humanity. Deontology was like 400 years ago.
Right.
Utilitarianism was like 100 years ago. So these things are very modern ethical theories. And yes, divine command theory might be unique, but it's also, that is a framing by modern ethicists. The entire concept of divine command theory comes from modern ethicists who are secular.
The names might be new, but the patterns of thought that inform the moral theory might be much older. I think of deontology, for example. Kant was the 1650s or something like that.
Right.
And but when you go back to who was it that wrote Antigone? It wasn't Euripides. Sophocles, there we go. Yes, thank you. With Antigone, you have the assertion of a duty to bury your family in the proper fashion, to give them a right burial. And that's a higher duty, a higher law than the law of man.
Right.
It's asserting a moral duty that transcends transcendentalism, thank you, Kant, that transcends other, utilitarian concerns. So whether that's right or wrong is sort of beside the point in relative to the fact that these ways of thinking about morality and right and wrong and what's the good life and so forth might be a whole lot older than the names we give to them. Especially where...
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. But I'm saying the fact that we are giving names to them is itself the paradigm. That is the framing of the argument. Like when you go into a debate and you frame an argument, or when you're in court and you give a narrative, like, well, this isn't a case about a murder. This is a case about a wife who was abused for years and finally, shot her husband because she had to. Like he just had to die. Like that's, you're framing the argument. Likewise, divine command theory as an ethical theory itself, that is a modern concept. Like you wouldn't go back in time and talk to people about ethical theories and they say, oh yeah, my ethical theory is following the scriptures. Like,
sure,
it's not an ethical theory, it simply is life.
We've
just like Sophocles.
Post hoc given categorical descriptive names to things that existed without a name prior.
Right. From our modern secular perspective, right? Because Sophocles or even Augustus or Julius Caesar, like these people were not thinking, well, this is paganism. This is, we're pantheists and we believe that, like, no, they weren't invading Carthage saying, well, you guys have to worship Jupiter. It was just life. It was life itself.
So speaking of Carthage, let me get us back on the subject of Christianity a little bit. And while we're talking about moral intuitions, I want to read this line from Augustine's City of God. And I want you to give me your emotional reaction. So the context is Rome has just been burned. It's been sacked by the Goths. And in this context, in this world of Rome having been sacked after converting to Christianity predominantly, and now many Romans are wondering if their forsaking of the old gods was why they were unable to defend their city. Mm-hmm. And Augustine basically wrote the City of God beginning as a polemical response to this movement, and basically saying that the old Roman gods wouldn't have saved you, but the Christian God wouldn't have necessarily saved you either if you were more faithful. Rather, the Christians just don't need to care. And he says this, if those who lost their earthly riches in that disaster, the sacking of their city, had possessed in them the spirit thus described to them by one who was outwardly poor but inwardly rich, that is, if they had used the world as though not using it, then they would have been able to say with that man who was so sorely tried and yet was never overcome, I issued from my mother's womb in nakedness, and in nakedness I shall return to the earth. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away. It has happened as God decided. May the Lord's name be blessed. Thus a good servant would regard the will of God, again, the sacking of their city, as his great resource, and he would be enriched in his mind by close attendance on God's will, nor would he grieve if deprived in life of those possessions which he would soon have to leave behind at his death.
Well, I think that's easy to say when you're in Africa. You know, he's in Hippo. He's not in Rome.
Well, he's from Hippo. He was in Rome.
He was in Rome when this happened.
I believe so. He taught in Milan. I know he was a professor of rhetoric even before he converted to Christianity at 34. But he
right. I thought he went back to Hippo.
You know, he might have been.
He became Christian.
But in either case, in other passages in City of God, he speaks of the Christians who were, you know, fed to the lions or variously killed for their faith, and the sentiment is the same throughout. The sentiment is the same. It's a variation of what we saw before in talking about war. It's like, what's the problem with people who are going to die anyways, dying a little bit sooner? What's the point of caring about this city that is going to end anyways, getting sacked? It's like, oh, well, you know, don't worry about that. Focus on your soul. Focus on your spirit. And it's that detachment, that spirit of detachment that permeates the New Testament. Mm-hmm. Completely. And so if people are motivated to re-explore Christianity out of some desire to save the West, or to help their nation, or to provide a home for their family, or to provide a better future for any of these things here on earth, that hope is misplaced. Right? Or at least theologically speaking.
Yeah.
Well, no, Jesus says this, right? Jesus says this. It's not just
but
Augustine.
If you look even to the Middle Age, I mean, the Crusades were obviously not in that spirit. The Middle Ages themselves, the Milites Christi, the Soldiers of Christ, like, these things were not based on that sentiment by Augustine. But there are also, like in Hinduism, right, in yoga, there are the classes of people. I'm not a saint.
Well, you're familiar with Pope Urban II's speech at Claremont, correct? The speech that launched the First Crusade?
Possibly.
He says, but if you're
a refresher on that?
But if you are hindered by love of children, parents, and wives, remember what the Lord says in the Gospel. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Every one that hath forsaken houses, or brethren, or sisters, or father, or mother, or wife, or children, or lands, for my name's sake, shall receive 100-fold, and shall inherit everlasting life.
Yeah, but isn't that the same thing that we tell soldiers right now? Like, don't you love democracy? Don't you want to defend your neighbors and your friends and your family?
Which maybe brings us back to the connection between Christianity and modern liberalism, which Mencius Moldbug calls ultra-Calvinism. He has a very technical...
There's no real difference. People have been sent off to war forever, like since humanity began.
So might we say that they're both wrong for the same reason?
Not really, because I think of Sparta. I mean, Sparta, what are you going off to war for? Are you going off for glory? Honor?
For glory and honor in the context of their nation. They have a set honor group. And this could go into a conversation about honor versus dignity in Christianity. But honor is a real thing that exists in some societies, but not in Christian society. Well, all glory goes to God.
That's debatable. Right, but your glory is in God, right? So people like St. Augustine, the saints are glorified. And that's in the liturgy as well. The saints, that is the glory of Christianity. Whereas in a robber state like Sparta, your glory is in being able to kill everybody else and take their goods and bring it back home. So there is an abstract concept, though, at work in both of these things. You're willing to die, to lay your life down, either for eternal glory in heaven with the saints and Jesus and Mary, or
right.
So that everyone will remember your name, and your name will be passed down through generations, and your glory will live on forever. This is how
heroism.
Exactly. This is how you gain eternal life, by heroism. This is how Achilles lives forever. Odysseus lives forever, because people to this day say their names. So to the Greeks, they are immortal. But they weren't, and Achilles is actually one of those examples. Like, he had the choice, and he made the choice. He didn't do it for his country. He didn't do it for his wife and children. He did it for glory, for that abstract concept.
Right. And we read in the Odyssey that he regrets this choice, and that this is considered to be a path not worth taking after all.
Well, and in Dante's Divine Comedy, he's also in hell for that. So
right.
But Odysseus as well. Odysseus left home, spent 10 years fighting, and 20 years he's without his home and his family. And was that worth it to go fight in this war to gain glory? Well, was it worth it for his father to be on the Argos, right? Like to go get this golden fleece? Like, that's really the stress in all human history, and at least in the West. It's like, do you go for glory, or do you stay home like Telemachus? Are you a home person for family?
I feel like this might be our segue point into talking about paganism as a possible alternative to Christianity, because now we're delving deep into Homer, which is sort of my jam. And the dichotomy is an interesting one between, for glory in the hereafter with God, or immortal glory in stories. But when we look at the conception of God as a God of the Word, who creates by way of the Word, and Jesus is the Word, and all these other sort of extrapolations from, and one might say perfections of, Greek concepts of heroism, it begins to appear like a distinction without a difference. That Christianity is not some alternative to Greek heroism, but actually a sort of ultimate expression of Greek heroism. And the true alternative is not between Greek heroism, immortality in stories, and life everlasting in heaven, but between, immortalization in stories, which is the same thing as Christianity, which Achilles tells Odysseus is in fact not worth pursuing, was a mistake, or the path of the man, andra moi enepe musa malapula, that we see in the Odyssey, which is the path of mental connection. You do these things, you go out to connect with your the ancestors who did this before you, to connect with, and by participation in the rituals of your society, in the hero cult actions of your society, you mentally connect with other people in your society. And that's how you develop discernment. It's also how you develop the skill, the mental furniture and framework to accurately communicate with other people, even. It's the hero cult is the basis of, it seems, language itself, at least ritual surrounding hero cult. And so this mental connection can be another reason that you might take an action, whether that's going to war or not going to war, as Odysseus attempted to do by pretending to be mad. But his attempt was seen through, and they managed to impress him into service anyways. And then once he was at war, he wasn't trying to die on the battlefield, but accelerate things, and so he could get back home sooner. And so this alternative of mental connection, which we see in not occult paganism, but in what we might call classical paganism, is maybe an alternative ideal to immortality, where you're not seeking to be immortal or to live forever, but rather you're seeking to be a part of something greater than yourself. And it might have been a lecture that you sent me, where a Catholic priest describes the aesthetic visual depiction of filial piety in the Aeneid, of
I remember a post on that recently.
Of Aeneas carrying Anchises on his shoulders, and Anchises carrying the hearth gods, who are the remains of their ancestors before. And they don't know where they're going. Their city's burning behind them. But there, in that picture of the young man carrying the old man carrying the dead on their shoulders, moving forward into an unknown future, is, it has crossover ties to Confucianism, if we wanted to go eastward. But it's a completely different frame of what the good life and what virtue looks like from the heroic mode of meaning. And in the European tradition, heroism is a necessary pass-through. It's a necessary phase. You're not going to get that connection without doing the heroic rituals, without participating in that and being a hero, an initiate into the hero cult of your culture, at least for a time. But if that's where you stop, you're going to wind up being disillusioned, because the words, the logos, right, that they use to convey these ideals is going to be insufficient, and you're going to be like me 4 years ago thinking, I spent all this time defending free speech, and it sounds like no one in my society actually cares about free speech. And then you realize you were mistaking a phrase for the actual thing itself, which can't be, I'm jumping all over the Eastern stuff here now, the Tao which can be spoken is not the true and eternal Tao, right? The spirit that you are emulating in pursuit of mental connection with your tribe, with your family, with your nation, with other people, because identity is sort of concentric, it's something words can only approximate. It's not something words can actually nail down precisely, which is why immortality through words is perhaps like chasing after the wind, we might say.
Right. But in either sense, they're chasing for immortality one way or another, whether it's through glory, where Achilles is passed down because of the word, or it's in that image of the Aeneas.
Mm-hmm.
Love God. Aeneas carrying his father, is carrying his ancestors, right? So there is immortality in that sense, like Francis Crick and DNA, like that's really immortality, like when we pass down our genes or whatever. Right. And then there's the immortality of heaven, right? In any of those senses, like you're still there, like you said, there's something beyond yourself. It's not just I'm sitting on my farm and taking care of the kids and my wife. Like there's something beyond that humanity is trying to get to. And the question is, what is the truth, right?
Right.
And when you're talking about the hero cult, isn't that what Christianity is? It is a hero cult.
Yes.
100%. And Christ, his heroism is 100% submission to God. That is the ideal hero, is to submit even unto death to God and God's will. So
right.
Really,
not just to die, but perhaps even to kill your own son.
That actually, yes, that it's that is a real thought experiment or dilemma, I guess, that's posed to Christians. You know, is that would you kill your own son to save your enemy? I've heard other Christians talk about this moral dilemma. It's not really a classroom thing, and it's God forbid something you'd ever actually have to face, but it is a real fundamental question. Which do you love more? The fruit of your loins or God himself? And that's the story of Abraham and Isaac too.
Right. That's why I chose the cover of Holy Nihilism that I did.
Right.
Because it really is
a horrific scene, and it's one of the most frequent criticisms of Christianity is, what kind of God would tell a guy, take your son up there and kill him? And he saved him at the last second, but what must have been going through his mind?
Right.
Well, you think of Joseph being sold into slavery. Like, he didn't know Joseph was sold into slavery for like 30 years. He had no idea. He thought his son was dead. Like, what kind of God lets a father go through that? So that's one of the recurring criticisms. Yeah, right. He commands that sort of obedience, right, and suffering. And that's a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah, well, and it brings me back to the whole moral intuitions that undergird the foundation for Christian belief. Like if God could command people to do something, and to be totally clear, if Christianity is true, then we have no basis for saying any of these commands are wrong. There's no basis whatsoever if Christianity is true. But we don't know if Christianity is true. We have to figure that out. And part of our search for the truth of Christianity is whether our moral intuitions align with the moral assertions of Scripture and of the tradition of the church.
Well,
and so
I would argue the converse, that perhaps if our spirit or if our moral intuitions do not align with the teachings of the Catholic Church, then it's our moral intuitions that are wrong, and that we have been corrupted, as I will be first in line to say that I was just plain wrong on a lot of things. I had no moral intuition or compunction about adultery. Absolutely none. Like, I was all Genghis Khan. I'm going to destroy or impregnate everything in front of me until I die, which I never will, of course.
Right.
That was my moral intuition. So people like C.S. Lewis, oh, well, we're on the same page, right? Like, we all have been, like, no, that's not true. Like, read Marquis de Sade. Marquis de Sade pointed out repeatedly throughout all of his horrific books, Juliet, Justine, all these things, there is no such thing as a categorical human moral intuition. Like, what is evil in one place is not in another if you leave it up to human beings.
So you would say then that the Christians who argue that our shared sense of moral right and wrong is itself evidence of a moral lawgiver, as C.S. Lewis opens up Mere Christianity, are perhaps misguided then?
Well, they certainly were not living in the world that I've lived in. They might, in polite British society, he might think, well, we all seem to be on the same page, right? We all think murder's wrong. We all think, well, you shouldn't commit adultery. Like, maybe they did in their homogenous, nice Victorian society. I don't know. But where I have been, that is not the case. People oftentimes are so morally bankrupt and beyond any help but divine help that it's, and one of the biggest things that changed my perspective was the understanding of the flood, that there is a reason for divine vengeance.
And would you say these people in your life who are morally bankrupt, is the evidence of their moral bankruptcy in the outcomes of their lives?
You mean the effects of sin, I suppose, would be the Christian term of it.
Right.
Yeah, so, in the dogma, there is no one beyond redemption. And I'm certainly not sitting on a moral high horse when I talk about people being morally bankrupt, because I was one of them.
Augustine of Hippo was there too.
That too, so, exactly. Yeah. Is a good role model for me. That's actually my name in the Catholic Church. My confirmation name is Aurelius.
It's a nice crossover from Augustus to Augustine.
Exactly.
Yeah, he did worse things than steal a pear.
So
as he wrote about in Confessions.
Yes.
I guess for me, there's a certain personality I've seen in many churches, usually very heavily tattooed, maybe involved in prostitution, maybe involved in gang culture, maybe involved in drugs, all kinds of bad things. And they come out and they say, God and Christianity turned my life around. Mm-hmm. And, y'all need to find Jesus so that you don't end up like I was.
Right.
But of course, when you go back to the early days of the church, you think of the early Christians being fed to the lions, or persecuted, or killed en masse by the Romans who were not a big fan, or the Jews for that matter. You think of Jesus Christ on the cross. Who would look at Jesus and say, like,
I would end up like that.
What moral failure brought you to this point?
Exactly.
From within the Christian framework, it seems kind of odd to judge, what is moral and not by outcomes, And I get that they are. It's not a double standard because they are actually different standards. Like, you can't say, oh, this pagan standard is about worldly power and it fails to deliver, while this Christian standard is about the hereafter, so it doesn't deliver in this real world. It's, they're in some sense not comparable, but there are things that matter in this world besides, either eternal life or worldly power. And that kind of nous, which, to its credit, the Orthodox Church has a long tradition with, although they have the sin of calling it nous, which is annoying. But that mental connection, which is actually theologically a deep part of their belief. And you can, there are, how do I put this? Less grandiose desires that are no less spiritual and no less worth pursuing in the here and now, that aren't tied up with a naive concept of immortality through language, whether that's song or the Logos incarnate or what have you, but aren't nihilistic and unenlightened hedonism either. And to me, that path is visible in classical paganism. That path is visible to a degree, although it's different, it's weird, in Judaism, and it's visible in a I would say a fairly admirable way in Confucianism, and to a degree in Shinto, and in many other rural pagan localized classical traditions of that kind. I'm not speaking here of the occult, which is very individualistic and about power and things like that.
Yeah. So that's actually the dilemma of the cross, right? And that's the foolishness of it that St. Paul talks about, is that if you're judging things by effect, no one wants to end up there. That was the most humiliating way to go. It was the worst possible death you could have. There's no glory in it. All these people who thought the Messiah was going to be a military leader to get Rome out of Judea, like, that clearly is not the case. So how do you make sense of something like this humiliating public death? If those are the fruits of what you're doing, like, I don't want any part of it. And so there's got to be something far beyond that. There's got to be something more meaningful. And when you're talking about the effects of sin, though, I think there's a distinction to be drawn. Your life ended up in a horrible place. I ended up in jail, to be very specific and concrete about the illustration.
Well, so did Paul.
Exactly. Right? We ended up in the same place, but for completely different reasons. So if you're judging just by the outcome, well, you both ended up in jail, and St. Paul died. Like, so you're coming out on top. What do you think about it, Augustus? That completely misses the point, right? It's not just the effect of what's going on in the physical world. It is something far more spiritual. Like, when I was put in jail, I didn't do those things that I was accused of, but I had done a lot of horrible things, and I was certainly paying for it. And the entire reason I was there because I had committed adultery, and I had had a child out of wedlock. And that realization was what started turning me around on this whole thing. At some points, things like jail or death of a loved one or the loss of all your possessions, bankruptcy, humiliation, these things where you have to be on the cross, these are periods of purgation. And again, that's not just specific to Christianity. Purgation is a religious concept throughout the world, where you are being purged of that sin and the effects of the sin in your life. For somebody like St. Paul, showing up in jail or Jesus dying on the cross, like, there actually is a Catholic answer to that, that Christ was crucified in order to take upon him the sin of the world. So
right.
While he was innocent,
so
he
maximizing
was nailed to the cross because of us.
Maximizing
all of our sin.
Pain and humiliation is the point.
In a sense, yes, because it is purgative, like the scourging at the pillar. When you're praying the mysteries of the rosary, for instance, like that scourging, that is purgation. When you are crucified, that is death because of sin. And the resurrection is you have turned to God and you are being revived because you have turned away from sin, and now you will have eternal life in heaven.
Yeah.
So there actually is a reason.
And you see that with Mother Teresa too. She was criticized by Hitchens and others for, she's not really helping the poor. And it's like, well, yes, that wasn't the point. She was around the poor for her own spiritual development, about purging her. It's a memento mori exercise in remembering one's mortality and in confronting one's own sin that could have, brought these sorts of sufferings upon yourself there, but for the grace of God go I, so on and so forth.
Right, and you can point out the same contradiction in Buddhism, where you're only doing these things so that you can be freed from the wheel of samsara, right? You're not actually doing these things because you're a good person. You're doing these things because you want to be free of karma. You want to be free of all this, slavery and whatever. Like it's ultimately, it comes down to a selfish motive. And a cynic could say something like that about Mother Teresa. Well, this is really only for her benefit. Or you could say the same thing about St. Paul or any other saint. Like, you're only really doing this to get into heaven, right?
It was about her, but that's not a cynical claim. That is the right thing to do, is to confront the suffering and it's not as if she wasn't also trying to help them. But the point was not so much to help them as to surround herself with suffering and death so as to get closer to Jesus. Because Jesus' existence was suffering and death. And the more you voluntarily take that suffering upon yourself, the closer you are to Jesus in that way. That's the idea, anyways.
I think that's the point for the regular Christian, for all Christians, right? To undertake these things, and that's the love of will, right? It's not sensual love. It's not the thing you want to do. It's not the thing that makes you feel good. It's the thing that you are doing because it is the will of God. That's love of will. So these are the two distinctions in love. So yes, Christians will act in that sense, but I think the dividing line between just a regular old Christian and a saint is that there comes a point in those devotive acts that it's not about you any longer. It truly is selflessness. And I think that's something that we can't comprehend or see clearly, because that just doesn't register in our world. I certainly don't act in that sense. Even in the most selfless places I've ever been, like fighting for my kids, still, when you think about it, it comes down to selfishness. I want my children. It makes me feel good to play with my kids and be with my kids and raise them. So ultimately, yes, it is selfish, but ultimately there is a point where you will come to selflessness. I think that's the entire Catholic journey.
So does that bring us back to the rejection of family I was bringing up earlier? Does that bring us back to the idea of rejection of nation?
Right. So when you are a saint, I think that's the dividing line. At that point, maybe there is no distinction. I don't know, because I'm not on that side of the bridge. Where I am, there is fighting for family, fighting for tribe, fighting for your people. That's where I am. I don't know where St. Augustine, Mother Teresa, St. Ignatius of Loyola, I imagine they don't feel the same about fighting for their kids or fighting for their country. I mean, Ignatius of Loyola was famously a soldier who was injured in battle, I believe by a cannonball. And much like Hitler or Guido von List, he's in the hospital and he has this spiritual awakening. And he turned away from all that. And some of his spiritual exercises, they had the imagery of war, but obviously he forsook war. And I think it's clear that almost all saints that I can think of off the top of my head, they were not, devoted family men. They were devoted to Christ and the church and God. That was their family, and their reward was in heaven.
Right. And I guess for me, that brings it back to the whole moral intuitions thing. And perhaps there is a basis for belief in Christian doctrine that isn't grounded in that moral intuition, that the world is fallen and the sort of moral ontological argument that the perception of evil implies a sort of objective counterforce, an objective good that must be on the other side, and that we can pursue and have a connection with that objective good. I don't believe such an objective good exists. I believe good is divergent. There are conflicting and sometimes competing standards of good. And this is why excellence takes a long time to develop, because it builds over time. It's not like you scratch away the illusions of the world and truth is revealed underneath. As far as human spirit and perfection, refinement go, you look at a wolf chasing a deer. There's no, like, morality is not a role. It doesn't play a role there. The good wolf will catch the deer, and the good deer will escape the wolf. And what's good is for one is going to be bad for the other, and vice versa. And evil doesn't really play a role there. But what we see evil is in the human conscious rejection of all standards, the disillusionment and resentment that leads us to be like the Joker or the comedian in Watchmen, or someone who's just like, it's all bad. Yeah, it's a sick joke, and we see this in Thersites in the Iliad, and we see this with Marxists today who pursue a ruthless critique of everything existing, to quote a certain 1843 paper. And that evil is a convergent thing. And David Foster Wallace had a famous quote about TV being a low art because it's the center point, it's the lowest common denominator. And it's not that people are stupid, it's that we're really stupid in what we're common. We're stupid in what we're common about, but we're wildly divergent in our refined and high and developed tastes and abilities. And so the larger the audience becomes, the lower the common denominator has to be, which is unfortunately a tragedy when it comes to a universal religious project.
So let's take that, just the subject of good and evil for a second, because if you, I think this is illustrative of the entire debate that we're having. If you take a step back and you think about this, you are approaching this very intellectually.
Right.
Let me think about this. Let me compare this religion and that religion. Let me compare this text. Let me read these things. Let me think about this from a rational perspective. I'm doing quite the opposite. I am doing everything from personal experience and reasoning based on a somewhat mystical experience with reality, that I my personal subjective reality. And I think good and evil is one of those things. Because as everybody knows, I was a philosophy major. I did not believe in good. And I'm a Nietzschean through and through. I mean, I've been reading Nietzsche since I was 13. Thus Spoke Zarathustra has been my favorite book since I was 14. Nietzschean 100%. There is no good and evil except what powerful men have made and passed down. And these are the codes that we are given and we agree to. The genealogy of morals, right?
That's Thrasymachus from Plato's Republic as well.
Yes, that's right. Mine is right. So I didn't believe in good and evil until I was in jail. And I was served, rather. I didn't receive it. The sheriff showed up while I was in jail and served me with a petition that was so outrageous. I won't get into it for personal reasons, but it was so outrageous that was the moment that I was like, there is evil in this world. And from that point, I started understanding. What's that?
I said no disagreement with evil.
That there is evil in the world, right?
Yes.
And you're saying that evil is convergent, good is divergent. You are thinking of this in a very rational perspective. I'm thinking of it at that point, I truly believed in evil as a force in reality. That changed my conception on a lot of things from a mystical perspective, not from a rational one. Okay. And it was only a long time later, after suffering all these things, that's when the reasoning even became a factor.
So by mystical, do you mean you had an experience and a conclusion spontaneously emerged from this experience as inarguably obvious?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's how I've lived most of my life, really. I'm a philosophy major. I'm a lawyer. Like, these are very cerebral, intellectual things. But really, like, I've said this in interviews before, which makes me look like a weirdo, but I lived a lot of my life based on my dreams that I've had that I thought were prophetic, and even if they weren't, they were certainly apocryphal, and they were things that shaped my life. And this is a concept that I heard growing up when I would see Marilyn Manson on TV talking about his dreams are what become in his songs, and he lives his life by it. Like, this is not a new concept I just came up with and thought, I do this.
Sure.
But I've always lived in that sense where there is a reality beyond the intellect that cannot be explained, and that reason is kind of an epiphenomenon of reality.
And the reality is, of course, reasoning can lead people astray, certainly.
100%.
But reasoning emerged in the Enlightenment as this great salvation of mankind, a candle in the dark, as Carl Sagan would say, precisely because mysticism can also lead people astray.
I have no disagreement. Because I was a thelemic mystic for many, many years, for my entire adult life.
And so, to me, this argument, this whole argument that I'm making is the moral intuitions that undergird our evaluation of the moral truth of Christianity or its falsehood are more like a mystical experience. When I read Luke 14:26, you must hate your father and mother. You must hate your family and even your own life. When I read Jesus say, I've not come to bring peace but a sword, to divide your family and nation apart. You could make some kind of intellectual, rational argument as to why loving your family is actually the correct deontological duty, and so this is therefore incorrect for some reason. But it's a lot more of a gut reaction than that. It's a lot more like, oh, that's obviously wrong. That whatever is behind this proves that can't be the right direction.
Exactly.
And
that's what I'm saying. I think that is where I'm coming from. You're talking about arguments and let's examine the text and all that, but really I think it comes down to you read that and you are put off by it. That can't be right. And I felt the same way about something like the story of Abraham and Isaac, right? Or the story of the Tower of Babel. Like, why would God do that? Why would he destroy this tower? Like, let them build their tower, let them have one language. Like, what kind of God just comes in and creates chaos because he's jealous of people building a tower? That was my reaction when I was younger. Now I completely understand it from a different perspective. And I think a lot of that is not because of, not even necessarily my experiences, but certainly not from intellectual argument, that I understand all of this in a different light. It's probably through the spiritual practices themselves, through celebrating the Mass, through taking communion, going to confession, confirmation, through prayer, through praying the liturgy of the hours, the divine office. Like, once you are Stations of the Cross, if you are living that on a daily basis, that is what starts changing your entire reality.
You're participating in the hero cult.
100%. Yes. Now we are speaking the same language.
Yes. I want to take a second to go through some of these live chats here. Division of Labor says you must take into account that those at the top are Satanists, not pagans. Yes, that's sort of the occult versus classical religious distinction we're talking about. And there are, of course, Satanism is a kind of Gnostic Christianity. They're borrowing from Christian mythical foundations. It's a cult, yeah. Martin says, I understand sacrifices to pagan gods are more like trades than atonements. Yes, 100%. Divine commands.
Ut des. Yeah, yes. I give so that you give. That was the understanding in pagan sacrifice. So yeah, I said they were like atonements because you have angered the gods, but It's
right.
not that they're mutually exclusive. In some events, yes, it was do des. I am giving you this bull so that you will bless my son in war and he will conquer and be victorious.
Yeah.
However, there were also the sacrifices where we don't have crops this year. There's a drought. God is clearly angry with us. We did something wrong, so we need to sacrifice this goat or this bull in order to atone for that. So
Tiresias tells Odysseus to sacrifice to Poseidon to appease his anger when he gets home.
Yeah, because Odysseus had offended him. He had blinded his son.
Polyphemus,
Yeah, he had done bad things to the gods. So he had to atone for it. Yeah, that's the concept of sin. They just don't use that word.
Martin also says divine command goes back to the feminine Semitic cognition. That's the only way law made sense to them, where autistic Europeans saw that the universe is governed by laws, including moral laws. That sounds like a whole other conversation to break down stuff. That's a whole other conversation. Anyway, he says to Europeans, law is sovereign. Even their gods were subject to the same law. So Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, famous Supreme Court judge. I am speaking to a subject matter expert on this. Said that the origin of European law, at least in the Germanic tradition, arose to try to put an end to the blood feud, and that's sort of what we see in the Iliad as well, where and we see this played out in The Godfather too. The rise of dignity culture over honor culture is not really about justice, but it's about preserving what you have. Justice says eye for an eye. True justice, I should say. Law says let's keep things reasonable here, and let's have a Leviathan to step in and say so far and no further. And we'll put an end to, and this goes back to, I think you can see the forerunners of it in the Iliad. You can see the sort of in the depiction of Achilles' shield. There's a city where there's a dispute going on between a man who's been killed. One side is trying to offer a blood price, and the other side is not. And you have a sort of a visual depiction of a quasi jury, but you don't see that really played out until Aeschylus's Eumenides. So I'm not sure that Europeans' law is sovereign in some sort of blood sense. I think that arose culturally, although it did arise a fair while back relative to maybe other parts of the world. But Eastern Asia has a pretty long tradition of law being sovereign. So anyways, you might have more developed thoughts on this.
No, I would actually point out the same things. And I was actually going to point out also from the Iliad and the Odyssey, the murder of Agamemnon, right? And
well, that's what kicks off Eumenides, the Oresteia. Right. Yes.
Exactly. You can't have these things. You can't have sons killing, avenging everybody. And like you said in The Godfather, especially the third one, which nobody likes, she's like, where are all the men? He's like, well, they're all dead from vendettas. That's what happens when you have to. You don't just want to kill somebody who killed your brother. You have to. It is the law of honor to kill the person who killed, and it just goes back and forth for generations.
And that's what made the final, not quite the final, the penultimate scene in the Iliad so profound, where King Priam sneaks his way into the Achaean camp and finds Achilles and kisses his hands and says, I've done what no father has ever done. I've kissed the hands of the man who killed my son. Give him back to me so I can give him a proper burial. It's like, that's one hell of a way to end a blood feud, but it did, at least for a time. None of these things are permanent, of course, though. And anyways, so you see the forerunners to that in the mythology there, but it's not about justice really. It's about the justice is the Furies. Justice are those forces that will madden or kill people until they go and seek vengeance.
Right. Right.
So Agatha.
Let there be justice, though the heavens fall.
Yes, Ruat Caelum. Fiat Justitia.
Fiat Justitia. Right.
Agatha, who is apparently Orthodox, says eating animals is also the result of the fall. I think that is conjecture. I know it's very popular in theological circles. I'm not sure what the argument for that is, but I've heard it. Man's fall caused all of nature to fall. That's why we can't look at nature and reason back to who God is, because nature is corrupted by the fall. Well, that's an interesting argument, but it would imply that the spiritual pursuit of science, of coming to understand your creator by looking at his creation, would be futile. It would be a pointless exercise, because you couldn't differentiate between what's fallen and what is reminiscent of its pure pre-fall state. I mean, when I look at a wolf, or any carnivore for that matter, you look at its canines, you look at its digestive needs, how it processes food, and you look at how these things evolved. I can't assume everyone believes in evolution in these sorts of conversations, but you can look at how they're designed, for that matter. And you say this animal was clearly designed to kill things. You look at the venom of a rattlesnake. You look at the skin of a poison dart frog, or just the teeth of any carnivore, and you're like, that is... Did man do that? Did our fall cause them to eat each other? Because they would have to... A wolf could not exist in a pre-fallen state. It would have to be such a different animal that it wouldn't even be a wolf properly. And it's not as if deer are harmless critters either.
Yeah,
so
they're deceptively.
So
but I don't think it's necessarily something to rule out, though, that animals would fall because man fell. Because in the dogma, again, the whole concept of the creation was that all of these creatures, all creation, trees, water, animals, they were all created so that man would have tools in order to know, love, and serve God. So if man falls, then all of these creatures may well fall with man. So all of nature, all of the universe that God created falls because man falls. I don't think that's too far of a stretch if you're already on the theological train. I
suppose
right.
I suppose it's one of the lines that Hitchens said is, if you believe, there is always a way to make these things work.
Right. Well, and that's the thing. It comes down to faith, 100%. And when I was on the other side of the fence, I never argue with anybody. This is as close to a debate as I get ever. I do not get into comment thread wars. I rarely even retweet people. I don't get into debates. I don't do them. I'll do interviews, but I don't debate, and especially not with Christians, because I would always say, look, in the end, I'm going to beat you 100% of the time. I know the Bible better than you. I know your own religion better than you, and you don't know it. And in the end, you are always going to come down to, well, I believe it. I believe it. I have faith, and you don't have faith. And that's really what it does come down to. Now that I'm on the other side of the fence, like, oh my God. Now I get it. Really was all about faith the entire time. They could lose intellectual debates all day, and God bless those apologists who do have all the answers. I certainly don't, but That's what it really does come down to. So you're either on that train or you're not, and I see it from a different light now. Right,
naturally, and it does retroactively recolor a lot of the content you see before. It's particularly interesting seeing Christianity through the lens of classical Greek paganism now, so you can see a lot of not so much crossover in the sort of Jungian perennialism that is sometimes common, but in a direct antecedent in the theology, in the idea of immortality in the word, developing using the same words and the same iconography, even talking about tombs and empty tombs in the old Greek world. and even crucifixion we see here in the Republic at one point in book 2, which is kind of funny. Martin says, I see Forerunner in Ramayana 2. Rama is punishing kidnapper of his wife just because it is a transgression against the moral law, even though at that point he no longer desires her. I recognize the value of Christianity in indoctrinating forgiveness and charity, but it reinforces something that already existed among Europeans. Those are excellent in-group values. Right. If everyone is deserving of hellfire, if everyone suffers under original sin, and at the same time is a bearer of the image of God, everyone's kind of in the same boat. Everyone is the in-group. What's that Galatians line? There are no men and women, no free men or slave, but all are brothers and sisters in Christ. Like specifically in Christ, like as Christians. That's not the psychotic, schizophrenic egalitarianism we see today, but it is a kind of forerunner. It is a kind of forerunner that Mencius Moldbug talks about. He goes on, that almost certainly contributed to the economic success of Christendom. Application of those values to the outgroups in the interconnected world, well, we know how that works out. I am actually not so sure, because Europe was not the only place in the world that became Christian. There are lots of places in the world that are deeply Christian, more Christian even than Europe, that did not fare so well. The Ethiopian church is one of the oldest churches. The Greek church is probably the oldest church. These are not places that ever did particularly well economically, and and facing similar in-group, out-group dynamics that other parts of the world faced, unless you want to get really Jared Diamond about it. There are parts of South America, Latin America, that have been deeply Christian since the 16th century, 17th century? Parts of North Africa and East Africa, parts of Eastern Europe, and even parts of Central Asia that have been Christian for quite some time, did not really enjoy the economic success that northwestern Europe enjoyed. So I'm not sure I'd be comfortable crediting Christendom with that success. I would be much quicker to credit Rome and Rome's Roman imperialism.
Taking over a machine like Rome certainly has its advantages.
Yeah. Well, and some nations were able to maintain that inheritance better than others. Britain did quite a good job holding on to what Rome left them. Other places, maybe, Afghanistan, not so much. It's probably why the Semites rejected it too. Possibly. I mean, the Jewish religion is very it's very in-group, out-group conscious in a way that's actually very closely parallels most other pagan cultures, and I would say that as a kind of compliment, though that doesn't make them an ally, for the reasons you would expect of every other pagan localized culture.
Think global, act local, buy local.
Or maybe,
my friend, we are at.
It is getting late. I better let you get off to bed.
Here.
We
do have mass in the morning.
Okay. Any last words you want to say before taking off? I might hang out with the chat a little while, so I'll give you the last word here if you want.
Yes, well, I'm trying not to turn into those people you were talking about earlier, where covered in tattoos saying you need to find Jesus.
Yeah. Well, so long as you're advocating the benefits in the hereafter and not the you need to turn your life around or you'll end up like someone getting eaten by a lion,
Well, I will say, the fruit of, because I wasn't just pagan, I was specifically a Thelemite, and I came to realize that the fruits of that, it's total self-destruction. you lose everything, and there's a very intoxicating power in occultism that most people, I think, underestimate, especially the people who don't believe that it's real or that don't think that magic is real. I've seen way too much to think that magic is not real. I'm 100% faithful that it really is real, but the end of it is absolute destruction. And not just in a St. Paul ends up in prison way. I mean, like an actual horrible way that it would take too long to describe here. But final words, I don't know. I just keep on trucking, I guess, because it's like my friend Master Chim always says. Like I've got a lot of people around me that hate one thing I do or another, and he, from his perspective on the outside, just sees like I'm just following true north on the compass. Like I'm trying to find out what is true. Well, I think if you keep doing that, you'll eventually end up in the right place.
You strike me as following in the path of Saint Christopher, the patron saint of travelers, and who famously followed the king and then found out the devil was more powerful than the king, so he served the devil, and then found out that God was more powerful than the devil, so served God, and found himself almost drowning under a river carrying a small child across. But just keep being open to experience and so forth.
Right. Who has more power?
Yeah.
And I really think I've plugged into it. I'm starting to mainline it. So.
It'll be interesting to see, because I think we can watch this play out in real time. There is, in my mind, a fairly popular occultist and someone who, like Odysseus, is kind of shunning the spotlight, but I would say is a modern American pagan who you would never think of as such, but is in the classical sense, and that's Matthew Crawford. Testified before Congress about.
I saw your book review on that, on driving.
Absolutely phenomenal. Yeah. And his book on driving is where he comes out as all but explicitly as taking a pagan position on these matters. But we'll see how their life trajectories go. If our mutual, I think, prediction holds, then we'll expect Scott Adams intoxicated, the occultist, I mentioned, intoxicated with that power you're talking about of persuasion and hypnotism, does self-destruct. It does seem like things could go that way, and we'll see what becomes of Matthew Crawford as well. I don't have Christian examples in mind. Robert Barron comes to mind, but there, I guess, worldly outcomes are less relevant anyhow.
Right, or at least they should be.
They should be, yes. Right. Well, anyways, I won't keep you too much longer. Thanks so much for coming on, and I know it's not a super comfortable conversation, but my hope is that it's beneficial to other people to see where people like you and I have been, especially relative to each other, and that there is a lot of depth, and if nothing else,
wild world, man.
Yeah. And if
switch sides like that,
in both directions.
People, like one of Yeats' Yires.
And if nothing else, that it does matter, and that it is, what else are you going to do with your life other than explore the deepest of the deep questions that do have an effect on how you live your life, and that do have an effect on who you become and what sorts of values you would aspire to embody in your life.
As far as what else you could do, I could go watch Netflix. Probably what I'm going to do it right now. Well, thanks for having me on, man. It's good to talk to you.
Thanks so much for coming. Bro. It has. We'll talk to you later. Take care.
Brother. Till then, peace.
Okay. Well, that was super fun. We still got 5 people in the chat. Are there any... you guys can comment on how you thought it went. I'll probably hang out for another couple minutes here. Anything you think we should have addressed but didn't? I won't ask who won, because it was more of a discussion than a formal debate. I've become very not a fan of formal debates. I think the idea of adversarialism as a path to truth is highly overrated. But I'll have to point Augustus towards Jay Dyer. I think he would like him. Jay Dyer is a very interesting guy. I had a very, very bad debate with Jay, but he's an interesting guy. And if you are of the Orthodox persuasion, or the Christian persuasion in general, you might find him interesting and worth listening to. So shout out to Jay for people who believe in adversarialism. We're getting more people in the chat. I'm sorry, late joiners. You probably missed the gist, the party. Augustus has already left, but hanging out for a few more minutes. I suppose I should show this book more closely. The arguments I'm making against Christianity are made more... I've developed them a little bit more since then, but at least more completely, if not more clearly, in Holy Nihilism. The argument I made here about moral intuitions undergirding Christianity, I call it the disontological argument. So it's the opposite of an ontological argument that people like St. Ambrose make, as far as knowing that God exists. Because ultimately it all comes down to, does God exist or does he not exist? And the ontological argument is one of the stronger arguments, not in its first form, but in some of the later iterations of it, is one of the stronger arguments for God's existence. And the logic of the ontological argument, I believe, can be used actually to disprove God's existence in the moral, from the moral frame, because certain moral truths are laid out in the Bible, and the moral intuitions, the conflict in the moral intuitions themselves reveals the incoherence of the worldview. That's the gist of it. As far as the crossover between the Greek and the Christian worldview, I'll shill another book, The Hero and the Man, a much better book than Holy Nihilism, if I may say so myself. It's about Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey and how they relate to each other and how they relate to Socrates and Christianity and Hegel and modernity in general. So, looks like we're dwindling out of people. Martin says, right, yes, it's a unique combination of aforementioned Christian values with European genetic traits, and I would credit the latter more than the former. Yes, you can't, as uncomfortable as this is for many people, you can't take genetics out of the equation. I would argue, and this after having spent some time in the European genetics traits is the most important thing world, that perhaps the mythology has more to do with it than the genetics. Not that the genetics don't have a role. They do. I don't think anyone serious about the subject and who's honest, who's looked into it, can deny that. But there are other factors. Language, religion, geography does play some role, even if Jared Diamond exaggerates it to absurd degrees. And yeah, I enjoyed the discussion. Well, excellent. That's mostly what we hoped for. There wasn't really a conclusion to this debate, other than that it's worth exploring. And as Martin points out, it can be deeply enjoyable to explore. One of my arguments for reading Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I would add the Bible to this as well, is that it deepens your enjoyment of literature and debates and these sorts of things. It deepens your enjoyment of the experience of living in the Western world. And finally, Martin adds, mythology of Europeans is an effect of their traits too. Possibly. Yeah, I suppose it would have to be a cause of something. Cause of an event, or caused by an event, or caused of a trait, or maybe many events get chosen from, and the things that they're natural inborn inclinations select for or rises to the top. Or perhaps it's random chance. Or, and this is sort of the direction I've been going in my own research and reading, particularly in the origins of language with the work of Ray Rappaport, is that perhaps the mythology arises out of the language itself. One of J.R.R. Tolkien's critiques of Hitler's Aryanism was that he says Aryan, the Nazi use of Aryan mistakes a linguistic category with an ethnic category. And when we look back in history, so the argument goes, mythologies tracked language groups more often than they tracked ethnic groups. There are some, obviously this is very, very contentious territory. Academics aren't totally in one camp or another, although they're certainly morally inclined against some camps, but you can't let that inhibit your own exploration. I'm sorry, Ignis, Imber, Augustus had to go to bed, but you can rewind and listen to our chat. I think that was a better part of 2 hours there. So, anyways, I should probably head to bed myself. So, thank you so much for coming and commenting, and hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And whether you believe or not, it's never a bad thing to read the Bible. In my opinion, it might help lead people away, might help lead people towards. But now the case, good night, everyone. Thanks so much for coming.